So here is my container home. I was adding some materials and some airbrush to this earlier today to try to flesh this out and give you guys some ideas of how you might add some contextual details to your images. So this is the end result. I'm going to walk you guys through how I got here. So if I turn off some of the textures, I can bring it back to my rough perspective. Remember, this is where I wanted you guys to end up today on some of your projects. You may need some additional time today after the demo to get here. But this is kind of like a rough doodle of what I wanted the space to be. So my line work isn't amazing, but this is designed where I have like some details in here. I have suggestions of windows and doorways and things that I might want in the landscape. So I've got this kind of wall over here that defines a patio space that is in between the two shipping containers in my plan view, right? So that was there. I have this half wall and beam that supports the cantilevered shipping container over here. So that is designed, that's in there. So it creates this outdoor entertaining space. I have some squiggled trees in here just to show some like positioning for landscaping. But the line work's not that great. And for how we want to use Sketchbook from here on out, we want the line work to be a little cleaner because it helps with selections and it also helps in masking the transitions between different textures and different materials. So what I did, which I kind of talked about last time, was I used perspective mode to set up a clean pass on the line work. Now, I didn't do everything, but I did the architecture part of it, so the boxes of the shipping container. And I did the walls, and I made some squiggles for the grass here, just outlining where the path is going to be and where the patio is going to be. So if you do these kinds of like squiggles in here, if I turn on black, something like this suggests this transition of grass to something else. So that is all defined in there, right? So, you can use perspective mode. We talked about this last time. You use rulers to follow your architecture, or if you guys are using Illustrator and that 3D plane, right? You can use the boundaries of that to set up your vanishing points in perspective mode. So I have a layer in here that helped me do that, right? If it's off the canvas, then you just expand your canvas wider in order to document where your vanishing points are. Keep that in your file because every time you close Sketchbook, it forgets your settings for perspective mode. So you have to go and position the vanishing points every time you start up the program. So just have a layer in here. You can call it vanishing points or VPs, right? That allows you to set up that perspective mode. So do you guys want to see any of that again, or do you get it? Do you want to see it again? I saw a couple nods. All right, so let me just make a new layer that I can then sketch on. So image, canvas size. For me, because I used SolidWorks to create my underlay, my vanishing points are pretty far out. I ended up cropping some of this away, but I still have enough of these rulers in here to go out. So that's in here. So you see how this could save you quite a bit of time just having a layer in here. So I'll put one vanishing point over there, another over here. And on my new layer, all right, let's say I wanted to put another window down here. All right. All of this is magically in perspective, right? Pretty cool. All right. So with 2-point perspective, I have vertical lines, right? And then anything going out to the vanishing points will go out to that point in perspective, right? So this can be really handy for doing rectilinear objects like shipping containers or other buildings or structures that you guys are working on. When you want to turn off your perspective mode, just hit P on the keyboard or toggle it from the toolbar up here. And you can go back and forth between the modes. So I was doing this quite a bit as I was getting some things placed on my line work. All right, so you guys can do that and use that to do a clean trace on your environment. All right, I'm just going to back up. I'll turn that off. So there we go. And you can crop to what's the right size for you. So that's easy enough to do if you select a rectangular selection, right? You can do that and then hit image, crop to selection, right? So you can get back to a normal canvas size. So we're going to be using this toolbar quite a bit today up here. So if you guys had Rapid Viz with Anne-Marie, she probably showed you guys how to use paths or selections in Illustrator and use Photoshop to airbrush in those selections. I think that I showed my class that too, but we used Sketchbook more in my class. So maybe you're not as familiar with those techniques. I want to show you guys how to do that same technique in Sketchbook just using selections. And I think what's most helpful is the polyline to make different selections in Sketchbook for doing illustration. So let's get into it. So I just hit all my textures in here. I'm going to make a new group for today. And I'll just call it demo. All right, so that's a new folder, new layer in here. And I have my clean pass at the top of my file because I want those lines on top of the textures that I'm putting in. That'll help me keep it visible as I'm moving in different materials, and I can use my polyline selection over it. So I'll start importing some textures, and I have a folder on my computer of things that I've saved online. You guys can go to Google or Pinterest and just search for some different materials or textures that you want. So I just grabbed a couple things. I've got kind of like a rustic brick texture. I've got this mossy grass texture. So this is kind of like a craggy wild grass, which I liked the look of. You guys could find different grasses too. So if you have like a manicured fescue golf course grass, like that's going to situate your environment a little bit differently than something that is more naturalistic like this. So you want to be aware of the types of images that you are selecting, because that will condition your designs to be viewed as located in a particular part of the world or designed for a particular user group. So I've got grass, I've got this kind of wall cobblestone texture. What I'm going to use for the siding is I've got this wood vertical slat texture. So I searched larch wood because larch is often used for siding. It weathers well in the sun and the rain, and it gets this kind of darker color. So I'm going to bring that in, and I want to show you guys how to use these types of textures with that selection tool that we have in that top toolbar. So I brought in one texture, but this in itself is not big enough to cover the side of my container. So I'm just going to duplicate it and move it. So quick transform, slide that over. And I'm going to try to keep an equal spacing in here. That looks pretty good. And I don't know if I'm going to need another one. That's probably big enough. So I'm going to merge this down. So all I do is I tap on that layer and I drag it down to merge it. I might drop the opacity a little bit just to see where I'm putting it. And then I'm going to transform it. So these 4 dots, this constellation up here, that's for transforming a layer. So I'm going to use my perspective lines to try to map this. And I'm not going to worry about getting it line to line because that's what my selection tools are going to be for. So I'm going to check that and say that that's done. You can see that that induces some foreshortening in the perspective. So what I'm going to do from here, and this is important, so make sure you're watching. In the selection tool in the toolbar, we have a lot of different types of tools. We can make a rectangular selection, which is easy. That's just like Photoshop. Oval, a lasso, which is like freeform, right? That's pretty cool. What I find most useful is this polyline one. So it looks like this geometric shape there. And you can use the mouse with this if you get more control, but you can also just use the stylus. And I'm going to go around my line work to give myself a selection of that face where I want that texture. Now, by default, when you make a selection that's a closed shape, it encloses the interior, but I want to keep that. What I want to do is I want to select the inverse, which is over here. So I invert the selection. I can go to my eraser. And with a big eraser, delete what I don't need. And I can deselect that. All right. Pretty cool and pretty easy, right? Let's do it again. So for the window and the cutouts, polyline. This is why having clean line work is important, right? By default, it selects the interior, which is exactly what I want. So I delete out that for the window. I can do it again over here. You can go one by one, but you can also do multiple if you select over here and add to your selection another shape. Easy. All right, there we go. With me so far? All right, let's keep going. So I'm going to duplicate that, drag it over here, make it wider because I want to cover this section in here, which is like the underhang for the balcony space. And I'll do the same thing, right? Make the selection, polyline, follow my line work. So this is exactly the same kind of technique as using Illustrator and Pen Tool to make paths. Whoops. I need to invert. Erase. Except that you're doing it all natively in Sketchbook. And I don't have to worry about creating 50 different paths. I'm working linearly. I'm working as I go rather than doing all of my setup in Illustrator and then importing into Photoshop across platforms. All right, so this should be an easy process. I used a flat texture when I brought it in. What if I want to show some gradation on this surface? Like if I want to show sunlight hitting part of that surface over there by the windows. So there's a tool in here when I say lock transparency. All right, I know some of you guys are already using this. Lock transparency, that means that I'm only painting over areas that I've already painted in the layer. So if I go in my colors, I select white and airbrush, big airbrush. Now I don't have to worry about these window cutouts because I have that lock transparency on. I'm going to lightly suggest that the sunlight is hitting back here. All right, I can do the same thing and add some shadow over here. All right, see I'm darkening that area? That's all because that lock transparency is on. All right, so this is all one layer if you merge down. So I really like doing that because it keeps your files clean and you don't end up with hundreds of layers. All right, so what's next? Let's do some windows. So I'm going to make a new layer. I can go back to here and I can actually use the magic wand tool. So in selection, we do have the wand tool in here. It's also W on the keyboard. And I already made these cutouts in the layer below. So I'm going to go add, boom, boom. I've got my windows. Go back to that new layer that I made. Airbrush. And in Sketchbook, you have swatches that you can configure, but you can also download from Sketchbook different color palettes. So I downloaded a landscapes palette. You guys can do the same. And it has curated colors for different landscapes, which is really handy. So tropical forest gives you a lot of rich greens. Northern, a little bit of desaturated. This is kind of like where we are, right? Northern US. Swampy textures. Forest glen, a tundra. So I want to pick a blue that might represent the sky. So some of these look pretty nice. Yeah, that's good. And on my new layer, I can go in here. I can add some blue. All right. Maybe some brown towards the ground. All right. Adding a little bit of color really makes your sketches pop, right? Like it's not totally desaturated or it's not grayscale. So don't be afraid to add a little bit of color. And don't be afraid to add a little bit of texture. So I have their sky and ground. Maybe I'll add reflection of some trees. I intend to put trees in here. So Sketchbook is great about having lots of different brushes. And there's one down here in textures. This camo one I found is pretty good for adding foliage. So I can add a nice green somewhere in here. I find the right size. I can add the reflection of some leaves. Find the right opacity, and I'll merge these together and I'll just make a layer called window. This can be siding. Okay. Now it becomes pretty easy to find those layers. I think this is blank, so I'll delete that, delete that. You guys with me so far? Seem doable, right? All right, what else? Over here, we could do the same process. So window, I'll give myself a selection. I go back to polyline. Okay, I'll make a new layer. Go back to my tundra blue. Well, that looks all right. Go back to that camo texture with a nice green. Looks good. You can vary colors too, right? That's good for foliage. Foliage, especially this time of year, rarely has the same color, so you might want to vary that a little bit. And that looks like a pretty convincing window, right? There's a little transparency there. We can see a little bit what's behind it. All right, let's put in a new material. So I'll add another image. I liked this rustic cobblestone for the walls. So I can go ahead, I can put that in, get it down to the right scale. I don't think I need to duplicate it for this wall over here. So that looks pretty good. I'll transform it. So be aware of, I'll call it the particle size of your texture. So every texture you use will have different elements in there, right? So I have these rocks. I want it to look realistic to the image. So I don't just automatically squash it like that just because that's what I sketched, right? I want those rocks to look realistic. So for me, I might stretch this out a little bit, and that might look appropriate. So I'll hit check, I'll keep that. And then I wanted to show you guys kind of the combination of airbrush and some line work over a texture like this. So I'll go back to, again, polyline, but instead of working just with the face, I'm going to select the whole object. So that looks pretty good. Hit invert because I want to erase the outside. All right, and I'm going to deselect. So now I can airbrush just directly over this. So let me go back to my normal palette. I'll go to black, shrink my brush a little bit, and I could lock transparency. I'm going to add a little shading over there, so it's a little three-dimensional, maybe a little ground shadow, and maybe some highlight on the top. All right. Now it's three-dimensional, or at least looks three-dimensional, even though I just have one flat texture, right? So that looks good. But if you guys remember from Rapid Viz, things look really realistic when you break that edge of the silhouette. So with this texture, what I can do, and you guys can do this too, if I turn off lock transparency, I can kind of follow the contour of those elements, the rocks in here, right? The particles. So I'm just bouncing out when I see a rock, really trying to push the perception of that three-dimensionality. And doesn't that look better? little bit more realistic. Okay. So I did that. What about getting some objects in here or some photographs? So in my folder, I found a few things that I liked, like this sconce. So this is really easy to work with because it's got a light gray background. So you guys can find something with a transparent background or a white background, which makes things pretty easy to work with. So in my plan view, I had something over here next to the doorway. So I can shrink this, but it's facing the wrong direction. So I go to Image and Mirror Layer. And I can move that. I can scale it to be about the right size. And it doesn't have to match the perspective perfectly. It just has to be pretty close. So you guys can screen this when you're looking at imagery. You can also just kind of cheat a little bit and erase the part that's not in the right perspective. All right, so just cut that out. You can use the magic wand. Delete some of the image. So that got me some of it, but the magic wand has its limits. So just go to your soft airbrush. And erase. Okay. That looks a little big, so I'll just shrink it a bit. All right, so you guys can do that for objects to populate the space. Furniture. I had I thought I had a bistro table in here, but I guess I got to go find one. So let's go find one. All right. Something like this could work, but maybe it's a little chunky. Maybe we want something more modern. That's kind of nice. Could work with that. You want to be aware of the perspective that you're setting it into, right? Something like this is looking too far down. That won't fit right into the image. But something like this might work. So I'll copy that, bring it into Sketchbook. Scale it down. And use the magic wand again. Maybe you need to add a little ground shadow. I want you guys to make good use of your time. So if it's important to your environment to have custom furniture and you want to dictate exactly what that is, then by all means, sketch it. For me, it doesn't really matter what table there is here. I just want to suggest that there's some seating and that this is how this space is used. For me, this is fine. Right? I don't need to design everything. I don't need to design the sconce. But I'm dictating like the big picture. So I do want you guys to design the big picture, but little things like this, they make your renderings look amazing when you have these little details in there. So use photographs, right? It's the same thing like using textures here. Will it look? It actually might look better to use a photographic texture than for you to like draw a cobblestone wall, right? So yeah, use your judgment, right? What's the impact that you want? I'll just show a couple more things. Right, working with landscape. So if I want grass in here, I mentioned this earlier, right? Get it down to the right texture size. What's the right scale? So that might be about the right scale, but I need more to cover this. What I don't want to see is, I don't want to see this hard edge here. So just use the soft eraser, hold shift, blend out that transition, right? Duplicate as many times as is necessary. Maybe I'll go one more. Merge down. Move to the right spot. And then use that transform tool to induce perspective. The more dramatic you make this, I think the more realistic it's going to look. So what we're doing here is we're just compositing different photographs to give that perception of like a realistic environment. Right, so you can use the soft eraser on some of the transitions so that your textures will look seamless, or they'll blend nicely together. I could use the hard eraser here or the polyline. Maybe I'll show the polyline again just so you guys feel confident in that. All right, going around a curve, I'll just sample points along the curve. And you can delete, you can use the eraser. All right, set some grass. If you wanted a tree, grab yourself a nice looking tree. And you can use the magic wand to delete out the background or the environment. So that looks like a good spot. With the magic wand, there's a threshold setting here. So 32 is not the right setting for me to grab this entire background. The lower the number here, the more sensitive it is. If you increase it, that is less sensitivity, which means that it ignores the gray here and it goes up to the green of the tree. Right, so this is kind of the contrast of the pixels. So that looks good. I can hit delete, deselect. Right. Adjust the opacity. All right, so you guys can do all of this, right? This is all in Sketchbook here. Like these selection tools are really the magic here. Right now I have 100% opacity on my line work layer, but if you want it to look a little bit more photoreal, just dial down the intensity of that line work. This means you have to be pretty accurate with your textures, but it could look really nice if you have really prominent materials and prominent textures, and you're taking some of that line work out of it. It'll start to look more like an illustration or a photograph, right? So that's a stylistic choice that you can do. So far, all of that's in Sketchbook. I wanted to show you guys a couple things in Photoshop, just because there's a few things in Photoshop that we can't do in Sketchbook. So if you save your file, save as a PSD, right? You got a few options here, right? If you save it as a Photoshop document, then everything will import as is into Photoshop. So let me pull up Photoshop. So a couple things Photoshop can do that Sketchbook can't is Photoshop has a bigger library for doing layer effects. So we'll do some motion blur on some figures, and we'll use Photoshop for that. I also want to show you the generative fill tool in Photoshop. So this can be helpful, and it's definitely worth playing around with a little bit. So for all of my textures and materials and objects that I'm putting in here, I'm using images that I find online. And what's nice about that is I know exactly what I'm getting, right? I'm searching through hundreds of different images to find exactly what it is that I want, and I import that. Let's say for this table, this one. Let's say for this table, I wanted to ask Photoshop to do this for me. So I'm going to make a new layer. What Photoshop needs is a selection, and it's going to try to fill that selection with what I've asked. So I can right click or up in the toolbar, find generative fill, and it gives you a prompt. So I'm going to ask it to put in a bistro table with 2 chairs. And let's see what it comes up with. The size of the selection seems to be important. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. For some reason, it elected to put the chairs in opposite directions. This one didn't complete the second chair. And this one's kind of scrawled in. What's interesting, that at least from what I've found, is that Photoshop tries to sample what is in the canvas at the time to try to tell you what it is, to like give you information of what it is that you've asked for. So I have this line work in here of my old table in that layer. So let's delete this, redo this exercise, but hide my rough draft. Right now, this is blank. Let's see what happens if we do the same thing. So I have a selection, right click, generative fill. Same thing, bistro table with 2 chairs. Let's see. All right. a little better, right? It doesn't look like squiggly lines. It's okay. It's not great, but I encourage you to experiment, right? Play around, see if you can get what you like. I found it easier just to go and find exactly the right bistro table that I wanted and put it where I wanted to in scale. But I think it's interesting playing around with these tools because maybe sometimes you'll get an application that works really well. So that's one thing that you can try. Second thing that you can try is warp and distort. So this curved wall in here, we could do the same thing that we did over here, but Sketchbook only does like a geometric scale, right? So it can only do on a flat surface. What if we wanted a curved surface? Some of you guys have curved objects or structures. So let's go put in that cobblestone texture again. Right. Bring this over here. Drag this over. So I'm not going to fuss with this too much just because I want to show you guys this quickly. So I have this in here. I've made it long so it'll fill the whole wall. I can transform this same as in Sketchbook, right? This is exactly what we were doing in Sketchbook. All right. But it looks like it's on a flat wall. So what you can do is edit, transform, and warp. And now you can push and pull and create this kind of amorphous scaling, right? So my anchor points are fixed and I'm pulling this wall like that. So you can do it that way, right? And play with some of the anchor points. What you can also do is on the top, instead of custom, you can have it do an arch, an arc, bulge if you want it to kind of go out from the center. Squeeze or pucker is coming in from the sides. So arch is what I want. And I'm going to do like a negative 20 degrees, negative 30 degrees. And there we go, right? That looks pretty good. Okay, so that's the second thing you can do in Photoshop that you can't do in Sketchbook that may be helpful to you. The last is working with figures. So if I go in, if I pull somebody in here, we'll just use this guy. There's a few ways that you guys can incorporate people into your projects, right? We've shown you in past classes that you can do like a sketch trace over a stock image, right? Maybe you guys did that in Rapid Viz. I can show you guys that again in this class, maybe at another time. But you can use stock images and do a line trace. That's fine. I like this image because there's a white background, which makes it easy to just take our magic wand and remove. So you can use a photo as is. I'm going to drag this above my line work just so it looks like he's in front of the space. So I can use him as is. I can add motion blur by going to filter, blur, and motion blur. Now he's walking fast, right? Change the distance. 5 pixels, he's walking slowly. 15, he's walking really fast, right? So you can see the difference there, right? That's kind of nice. I'm sure you guys have seen that in architectural renderings. If we want to make it look like he's turning his head, then we can make a selection just on his head and do the same thing. Filter, motion blur. Now it looks like he's turning, right? It's pretty fun. What else? We can take the magic wand. With the magic wand, I've selected the outside of the image. I want to switch that around and go select inverse. Now I'm selecting the inside of the image. And on a new layer, I'll just go edit, fill, and black. Okay. I can ghost it. Okay. So this is fine. You can do white fill, you can do black fill. There's other treatments too, if you wanted to airbrush some of this, up to you. But a couple different options for you guys to do figures. I think that's about it that I wanted to show you guys. I feel like if you do that on your projects, you could be really dangerous. You could make some really beautiful renderings with like just that stuff, even just in Sketchbook, right? Like you can do the black fill, right? You can do all that in Sketchbook. You don't need to do that in Photoshop. The motion blur you do in Photoshop, right? Advanced distortion of textures, do that in Photoshop. But everything else you can do in Sketchbook, right? Just using those selections. Any questions or anything that you want to see again?
Would you so like in your rendering right now, you don't have a lot of background. Would you also fill in the background?
I like to do that. So if I turn off my demo and go back to this one and zoom out, I added a sky, I added a couple more trees, I changed the opacity here, I added some shadow underneath this container. It's not that much more work. It's a little bit more time to find the right textures, but in terms of the technique, it's exactly the same technique to kind of populate this out. It's up to you, right? It's kind of your stylistic choice. Like let's turn off the sky, for instance. Not much changes. It's up to you, you know. What do you want it to look like? What's your slide design, right? Does full color make sense for your slide design? Would it allow you to inverse out text? Like maybe I could have white title text if I have that sky in the background. Or if I wanted to shrink something, maybe it's important that it's not full bleed color. If I do have white all the way around, then I can shrink it and put it into different sizes within my slide layout if I have a white background. So I don't know, right? It's nice that it's all here in the tree. I can toggle things on and off that I want to. I would recommend labeling your layers, merging down so you have fewer layers. It also relieves the pressure for you to feel like you have to go back and touch something up. It's really hard for me now to go in and like adjust the highlight that I put in here for the sun, right? It's good and bad, right? It's good that like now I don't have to do it. Like it's done, right? I don't have to go back and feel like I have to fuss with it. Bad if I ever wanted to change it. But I have found just merging down and working with fewer layers, that makes me a lot less stressed when I'm working, and I find it more fun to work in that linear way, right? I don't spend 75% of my time hunting for the right layer. I just go back and try to touch up what it is that I need to touch up. Other questions? Yeah, Nicole.
A lot of transparency. Is there a way to make a separate layer using the same shape that you have in the locked layer? Like if you did want to change the highlight, for example, does it have to be on the same layer?
You could duplicate the layer and then erase what you don't need. The way that the lock transparency works is it's looking exactly at that layer. So you have to have information in that layer. You can't lock it and then start a new layer and then be sketching over that. The right tool for that would be like the magic wand tool. So I can go in like my clean pass line work layer. I can go in here, I can use the magic wand on something like this, select my line work layer, use that kind of like how you would use Illustrator paths, and then click on a new layer and start sketching or shading in here. I think that's the better way to do what you're talking about. Yeah, Dave.
So if I have like the image that I'm like trying to use in the sketchbook, is the best way to like, I don't know, separate that image from its background and go in and erase?
If you can use the wand tool, that's probably the best way to do it.
In Sketchbook?
Yeah, if you're in Photoshop, you can use object selection, which is even easier, but it's kind of like the same. It's kind of, in my view, it's like the same thing, object selection and magic wand. That's probably the best way to do it. You're going to be hard pressed to use the eraser and like get the same results. It's easier. Sometimes it's easier just to find a different source image that's easier to work with that looks mostly the same. I know I showed you guys a lot and I know I talked for a long time, but I wanted to show you guys a lot of different tools and ways that you could proceed. To summarize, start with a rough draft, right? Design your space, but don't worry about how it looks. Just doodle, right? Just like in the first project, we did a rough pass and you did a lot of your thinking and your ideating without worrying about what the end result was going to look like, right? Just do a rough pass, just doodle, right? That's what I did to create my first layer. Then do a clean pass that you want to use for selections and textures. So you have a cleaner version of your line work, and then just start adding, right? Start populating. Go for the big objects and the big surfaces and the big spaces first, and then add some details towards the end. Play with opacity, play with saturation, play with general fill in Photoshop and see what you get. Right? Maybe you'll get some good results.